Most of my life, I lived in a small town that was filled with mostly Hispanics and not much else. When I moved to College Station, I was confronted with the fact that I would be surrounded by a lot of different types of peoples. And with that came a lot of stereotypes and preconceived notions that of people thinking like I was a certain way. So racism is more than just the hate crimes that you see on the news. There's a lot of different types of racism, and some are so subtle that you don't even notice them. It can just be a change in how people perceive you, or like if they want to be friends with you or not, just based on your skin color or maybe how you talk. Now, today we're going to speak on some experiences that minorities experience, and I have two examples that are true stories, though some of the details were changed for the protection of the victims. So, first, I want to talk about the different types of racism. The city of Seattle has a initiative called the Race and Social Justice Initiative, and it details four types of racism. So, the first type is interpersonal racism, which is the type that you usually think of when you hear racism. It can be discrimination bias towards a colored person by a white person, or even sometimes between different groups of colored people. Institutional racism is the second type. It's when policies, procedures, or systems work to kind of help white people more than the people of color, or it just harms the colored people indirectly. Internalized racism is the next type, which is when stereotypes and ideas by the white society affect how people of color perceive themselves and their culture and their heritage. Now, an example of this from my own racial group would be when Hispanics who have come illegally in past generations have children, and then their children look down on those who are coming illegally now. And this happens a lot. You see it in big towns and little towns. It doesn't really matter. You just see it pretty often, and it's surprising how much it happens. The fourth type is called structural racism, and that's when layers of institutional racism kind of overlap, and they just create a chain of racism that affects minority communities and individuals. And it also creates social narratives that are often pushed by the media. So now that you're more well versed in the different types of racism, we can move on to the first story that I have. And just to be clear, racism is not exclusive to the United States. And as such, I'm going to be sharing a story that happens in Australia first. So, the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, which is an Australian government group, described a story called Nina's Story. It's about an Australian with Turkish heritage who works in a restaurant, and her boss is just very racist. Their boss talks very poorly of people, of their customers, and of the workers, and they're not very friendly with the main worker that we're talking about. So one day, Nina is accused of stealing, and the boss has no evidence for this. So he's just making this up out of nowhere. So the boss decides to suspend Nina for 1 week while he basically does detective work to see if it really was her who stole. And he doesn't find anything. So once she returns after that 1 week of not being able to work, she realizes that the boss definitely spoke poorly of her because all of her coworkers are being very aggressive towards her, very, very rude, and they're saying a lot of very discriminating things about Turkish people, Muslims, and migrants. And overall, she just doesn't feel it's a safe environment. Eventually, she quits. And although this story doesn't have any kind of violence in it, this is something that happens to a lot of minorities. And it's often glossed over in the news because it's not something that is violent and that can really be, I guess, upplayed or whatever. So, during this whole time, she was harmed in many ways that weren't violent. She was shamed, she was mocked for how she spoke and like her heritage. And she was also barred from working for a full week. And to some people, a full week can be very detrimental to their livelihood. Now, the mockery and verbal abuse kind of feeds into internalized racism because it can make the victim feel like their heritage is lesser than whoever is speaking down to them, or just to other ways of life, like just a white person. They might feel inferior to a white person just because of how they were mocked. Now, violent forms are important to discuss, but they're often the most representative in the news. So for the next story, I decided to pick something that relates to students more and something that we can all relate to. OPB News and the writer Tiffany Kami writes about a story of a student who's trying to do their FAFSA forms. And usually it doesn't take that long for the FAFSA forms to go through and be processed. But for this student in particular, it took months. And deadlines were coming up and they weren't sure if their FAFSA was going to come in time. So the reason for this was actually because their mother did not have a social security number. And in previous years, this was not an issue. There was paper forms of the FAFSA that the students could fill out, and under social security numbers, they could just put zeros and it would still be processed fine. But recently, FAFSA went through a big change. I'm sure most of y'all know. And now everything was fully online. And a lot of students had a lot of issues with that. There was thousands of students who weren't able to do their FAFSA just because of this. And this is a clear sign of institutional racism because before, a lot of people were able to do it just fine. But now, because of social security discrimination, tons of children of undocumented immigrants are unable to go to school. And most of those people are people of color. Now, there are a lot of types of racism, and most of them are dismissed because they seem so minuscule to a lot of people. But as portrayed in this speech, it does affect people a lot, and it displays in ways that a lot of people wouldn't even realize. So sometimes racism is just so subtle, and you might even be participating in it in ways that you don't realize, just judging people for no reason. Now, people who are unaffected by racism, they need to be aware so that they're not perpetrators of racism. And also, they need to speak up to try to end it for those who are affected because they have more power than the minorities. Thank you.